I killed my parents and lived with their bodies for 4 years. Hello, I'm H.G. Tudor. The lady that you can see in the thumbnail is Virginia McCullough. She may be familiar to some of you, particularly those of you in the United Kingdom, as she has just been convicted of murdering her parents. The circumstances of these crimes provide us with a useful opportunity to understand more about the type of individual that she is. As per the BBC, Virginia McCullough knew why the police had smashed through her front door, but part of her wondered why it took them so long to discover she had murdered her parents. "Cheer up, at least you've caught the bad guy," she calmly told the officers handcuffing her. Neighbours thought John and Lewis McCullough had retired to the seaside, but the reality was they were killed by their daughter. Why did she do it? The goings-on inside the McCullough family home in Great Baddow, near Chelmsford in Essex, were becoming increasingly secretive in 2019. Relatives were asked to stay away, and friends were told Mr. and Mrs. McCullough had retired to the Clacton area on Essex's Sunshine Coast. The gruesome reality was very different. It would be 4 years before anyone found out the horrors that took place behind closed doors on Pump Hill. John McCullough, a retired business studies lecturer, had been fatally poisoned, and the 70-year-old's body was hidden in a crudely built tomb made out of breeze blocks and blankets. The corpse of his 71-year-old wife, Lois, was stashed behind sleeping bags and duvets in an upstairs wardrobe. Mrs. McCullough had been battered with a hammer and stabbed, but she too had also been poisoned with prescription medication administered by her daughter. Virginia McCullough, aged 36, was handed a life sentence at Chelmsford Crown Court for their murders, to serve a minimum of 36 years. The curtains were always drawn, and you couldn't see if anybody was in the house, said Phil Sargent, who lived next door to the McCulloughs for 20 years. They were just like shadows. They'd move very quickly from A to B. Mr. Sargent now knows why there was such secrecy at his neighbour's house. "I find it quite difficult even to say that Virginia murdered her parents, or killed her parents," he added. "She'd come across as quite pleasant. She was funny. She was irreverent as well. She had a dark sense of humour." In September 2023, Essex Police took a call from Essex County Council's safeguarding team. A GP, a doctor, at Mr. and Mrs. McCullough's registered practice had raised a concern for their welfare, having not seen them for some time. Their absences had been explained by their daughter, who offered a range of excuses for each appointment that she had cancelled on her parents' behalf. Conveniently for her, the country had been in COVID-enforced lockdowns for a large period of time. They had not been seen. But when police spoke to McCullough, it became clear something was not adding up. Why were her parents always out of the area? Alan Thompson, who rented a television to the McCulloughs, also had his suspicions. It followed a phone call from McCullough, abruptly cancelling the rental on her parents' behalf. When Mr. Thompson's staff arrived at the family home to pick it up, they were told they could not enter the property, and the TV was already prepared by the front door. "I got the feeling perhaps she was a bit of a fantasist, but no way would I have thought she'd be a murderer," he said. When police raided the property, it was not the first time they had visited. Weeks prior to the discovery of the bodies, McCullough invited officers inside to discuss an allegation of an assault against her. Only she knew the intent of this call, but some believed she was testing the water. Ultimately, the assault allegation came to nothing. McCullough was more forthcoming when officers returned in September 2023. "I did know that this day would come eventually," she confessed. "I deserve to get what's coming sentence-wise, because that's the right thing to do, and then that might give me a bit of peace." Documents recovered inside the property painted a picture of a woman desperately trying to keep her parents from discovering a financial black hole she had dug. Abusing their goodwill, she had been living rent-free, spending their money, and racking up large credit card debts in their names. Forged letters showed McCullough had been tricking her parents into thinking they had lost money through scams. In reality, it was money frittered away by their daughter. Now, pausing there, what have we got so far? Well, of course, the fact that she has murdered her parents is demonstrative of an individual who doesn't have any emotional empathy. An individual who has told lies to the TV rental individual, the GP's practice, also shows that that's a form of manipulation and an absence of emotional empathy. The fact that she has been tricking her parents into thinking they had lost money through scams is another lie and a form of manipulation. The fact that she had been living rent-free shows a sense of entitlement and a lack of accountability. The fact she has been spending their money shows a lack of boundary recognition and a sense of entitlement. It also shows an absence of accountability. The fact she has been racking up large credit card debts in their names shows a lack of boundary recognition, a sense of entitlement, and a lack of accountability. These actions of spending their money and racking up large credit card debts are criminal activities also. But what's the driver behind this? Is it an absence of emotional empathy born out of some form of disorder? Or is it the case that she is an individual where matters had got out of hand, that she was losing money as a consequence of her gambling problem, and therefore, in order to try and address that, she took steps which meant she was stealing and engaging in fraudulent behaviour? Was it the case that her emotional empathy for her parents and other people became reduced as a consequence of the external stressor posed by the gambling problem? Or does it go beyond that? Does it go beyond that the fact that she went so far as to try and trick her parents into believing they'd lost money through scams, demonstrative of something else? Is it the fact that she kept the bodies of her parents hidden, away from the world for such a long time, demonstrative of something else? Is it the fact that she went so far as to murder her parents, demonstrative of something else? Let us continue with the facts of this situation. To her parents, she was well qualified, suitably employed, and working hard towards becoming an artist, a future she claimed would also bring financial benefits for her parents. Is that an out-and-out lie? Or was it the magical thinking of an individual who truly thought that would happen, even though it was actually unlikely? Instead, she was reaping the financial rewards of manipulating, abusing, and taking advantage of her parents' kindness. Thus, she was exploiting other individuals for her personal gain. In total, McCullough benefited from £149,697 as a result of murdering her parents, combined from stealing from their pensions and spending on their credit cards, as well as selling assets. The court also heard that she spent £21,000 on online gambling between 2019 and 2023. Her lies and the fear of being exposed ultimately led to her cruelly killing her parents. Paul Hastings, a greengrocer at the Vineyard shopping centre near their home, had also noticed their disappearance. He was told by McCullough that her parents, who used to purchase goods from his shop, were no longer living in Great Baddow. A lie. Mr. Hastings said her peculiar nature meant she could say things without arousing much suspicion. She came into the shop and said, "The police are after me," "They think I killed my mum and dad," Mr. Hastings said. "I thought, that's a bit odd, but didn't think anything else of it. I just thought it was her eccentric nature." Notice that she's actually telling the truth, that there is no facade being utilised in this instance. Why is it that she felt compelled to confess as to what had actually occurred? Although she wasn't saying that she had killed them, she was essentially expressing her concern that the police were after her. Why was this absence of filter? Is it because there's some condition that causes her essentially to speak her mind in such a way? Or is it the case that she simply doesn't care and states without that filter because she has no emotional empathy? Mr. Hastings said that McCullough would sometimes visit his shop 4 times a day before disappearing for the next fortnight. Debbie Pollard said McCullough would visit the flower shop she ran and bombard her with food and presents. Is this a form of love bombing? Is it a form of coercion? "We knew she was odd, but I would never have dreamt she would ever be capable of doing what she actually did," she said. She's actually lived in that house all those years with her mum and dad's remains in there. That horrifies me. Horrifies me. Both Mr. Hastings and Ms. Pollard both said McCullough had also pretended to be pregnant. Lie. Even creating a fake bump under her clothing. Throughout her sentencing on Friday, McCullough stared at the floor, emotionless. It was only when she listened back to her interview with police, describing how she murdered her mother, that she began to weep. She looked so innocent. She was just sat there listening to the radio, McCullough told the officers. "I did go in 3 times to build up some gumption, but I knew I had to get it done and can't hesitate. She was just staring at me in disbelief." Detective Superintendent Rob Kirby from Essex Police said her otherwise composed reaction in court was typical of the considered, meticulous murderer she was. "Throughout the course of our investigation, we have built a picture of the vast levels of deceit, betrayal, and fraud she engaged in," he said. "It was on a shocking and monumental scale. McCullough lied about almost every aspect of her life, maintaining a charade to deceive everyone close to her and clearly taking advantage of her parents' goodwill. She is an intelligent and adept manipulator who chose to kill her parents callously and without a thought for them or those who continue to suffer as a result of their loss." Now, when the police attended on the property to arrest McCullough, there has been police body cam footage that has been released, and it shows them breaking down a panel in the back door. The police officer enters a property which looks rather untidy, and then finds McCullough stood in the hallway, having opened the door to the police at the front. McCullough offers no resistance. There's no surprise. She isn't angry. She isn't fearful. The police officer explains that he's arresting her in relation to the suspicion of her murdering her parents. She simply nods. The police officer asks her if there's anything that they ought to know about in the house, and she offers to take them to it. And to which the police officer explains, "No, just show me." And she basically said, "My father's through there. My mother, it's a little more complicated." She was responding in a way where you might just ask somebody where your parents were. If they were alive, my dad's in the sitting room, my mum's upstairs. Her delivery is entirely calm and emotionless. That is particularly indicative. It is also worthwhile examining the sentencing remarks of Mr. Justice Johnson, who passed sentence on Virginia McCullough. The sentencing remarks state as follows: "In June 2019, you murdered your father, John McCullough, and your mother, Lois McCullough. You have pleaded guilty to each of those offences." It is interesting to note that there was no trial that she put her hands up to the murders. She stated that she had done it. She was very matter-of-fact when she was arrested, and she has maintained that consistency thereafter, despite the fact that for a long time she lied about their whereabouts, created the impression that they had gone elsewhere, but ultimately saw that there was nothing further to be gained by maintaining that she was not guilty, and in the circumstances pleaded guilty to the offences. The sentencing remarks continue. You are 36 years old. You are the youngest of 5 daughters. In June 2019, you were still living with your parents. Now, there are many people that do live with their parents, particularly around that age group, but it does show a degree of a sense of entitlement to continue to live with her parents. It also shows a lack of accountability that she's not struck out on her own. Also, in comparison to the fact that all of her sisters had long since moved out of the family home. The judge continued by explaining, your mother was 71. She suffered from anxiety and agoraphobia and had traits of obsessive-compulsive disorder. Your father was 70. He suffered with ill health. He had hypertension, type 2 diabetes, hypercholesterolemia, and glaucoma. You did not work, lack of accountability, and did not have any regular income. You received payments from your father, sense of entitlement, and they relied on you to deal with some of their financial arrangements. You stole from your parents, lack of accountability and absence of emotional empathy, and secured loans in their names without their knowledge, commission of fraud, sense of entitlement, criminality, to increase the amounts you could take from them. You spent money gambling online, lack of accountability, and shopping, sense of entitlement. You lied, lack of accountability, about how the losses that they sustained were incurred. You said that they had been subject to fraud by others, blame shifting, or that there had been banking failures, or that they had been hacked. You invented police and corporate investigations with promises of repayment, promised gain, but they were always subject to delays. You lied to your parents about having employment when you did not. You lied that you had certain medical conditions which you did not have. From March 2019, you started to contemplate killing both of your parents, premeditated behaviour, planning. You say that was because you felt trapped, sense of entitlement, and you wanted to be free from them, threat to control. The reality is that you were trapped only by your own dishonest behaviour, blame shifting, lack of accountability. You must have appreciated that it was only a matter of time before your thefts and dishonesty would be discovered. By 17th of June 2019, you were almost £60,000 in debt. Notice that with McCullough, she has a parasitic lifestyle. She lives off her parents. She lives in their house and doesn't pay any rent. She doesn't contribute financially. She steals their money. She appears to have no realistic long-term plans. There's this contemplation about becoming an artist that somehow would aid her parents financially. But being successful in the creative arts is often difficult, and it isn't, for many people, something that can sustain their own lifestyle, never mind that of 3 people. You'll note that she's a pathological liar and engages in repeated deceptions. There's a lack of sincerity about her behaviour. She engages in conning. The sentencing remarks continue. That evening, this is March 2019, you placed a cocktail of prescription drugs in their drinks. The following morning, you found your father dead in his bed. Thus she murdered her father, absence of emotional empathy. Your mother was also in bed. You had not put so many drugs in her drink, and she had not drunk all of her drink. She was still alive. You had a backup plan for that scenario. You put that plan into effect. You hit her over the head with a hammer. Her last conscious moment was the realization that you, her daughter, had launched a murderous attack on her. She asked you what you were doing. She suffered defensive injuries as she fought for her life. You stabbed her with a knife 8 times, including 7 stabs to her chest, resulting in her death. Again, killing her mother in such a way shows an absence of emotional empathy. It was also the case that McCullough, when she struck her mother over the head with the hammer, realised that that wasn't going to work. And when she explained that during her police interview, she said, or words to the effect, "I hit my mother with the hammer and I realised that wasn't going to work, so I decided that I would stab her instead." She was very matter-of-fact about the delivery. There was no expression of remorse. There was no emotional effect as she explained this. She might have been saying, "I was trying to cut up the potatoes for making dinner, and I realised that in actual fact, using the bread knife wasn't working, so I swapped to a carving knife instead." The way that she describes the way that she killed her mother, she might have been telling you about the weather. It shows the objectification that's demonstrated with regard to her mother. The sentencing remarks continue. "That morning, you went to the GP for help with a cut to your hand. You had sustained that cut while stabbing your mother, but you said it was the result of an accident when cutting vegetables. Lie. Then you went to Chelmsford Town Centre to buy items to use to conceal your parents' bodies. Planning. The following day, 19th of June, you pretended to be your mother to obtain a new credit card and PIN. You then used that card to buy clothes and jewellery for yourself. Deceit, pathological lying, sense of entitlement. You set about concealing the bodies. You placed each of your parents in a sleeping bag that you had purchased on the 18th of June. You then placed your mother in a wardrobe that you then sealed up with tape. Later, you partially obstructed the wardrobe with breeze blocks. You placed your father in a makeshift mausoleum constructed from breeze blocks." Notice again that the state of mind of this individual is such that she doesn't take steps to remove the bodies from the house, presumably recognising that that would be too difficult for her to do on her own, and decides instead that she will conceal them in the house. She then lived with those rotting bodies and the attendant stench for 4 years. For 4 years and 3 months after you had murdered your parents, you pretended that they were still alive. Lie. That started right from the day of their deaths. That afternoon you sent a text message from your mother's phone to one of your sisters. The message was, "Your dad and I are at the seaside in Walton this week. Mum, kiss." Then, that night, another message. "Good night, Mum, kiss." You continued to send such messages over the following months and years. You even spoke to one sister, pretending to be your and her mother. This shows a pattern of pathological lying. You continued to send such messages over the following months and years. You even spoke to one sister, pretending to be you and her mother. You used a large number of different SIM cards to contact your siblings and others pretending to be your parents. You sent pre-printed birthday cards using an online service. You took your parents' pension payments amounting to almost £136,000. You telephoned your father's pension company, pretending to be him. You also spent money on their credit cards and opened new credit cards in their names and spent money on those. You used their bank accounts and took their winter fuel payments. The total amount you took was almost £150,000. Once again, this shows a course of pathological lying, stealing, fraudulent activity, demonstrating an absence of emotional empathy. You made calls to the police, pretending to be your mother, complaining about trivial matters. Now, to my mind, McCullough doing that is she's testing whether the police are onto her. She knows what she's done. She knows what she's done is wrong. She knows that she could get into trouble. And she wants to find out if the police have any interest in her, in the household. And therefore, almost like playing a game, she makes those calls to the police, pretending to be the mother, pretending to have problems, complaining about trivial matters. It's as if she wants to play a game with the police, not only to find out are they on to her, but almost in a way to gloat, to say, I'm calling the police and you don't know what I've done. You made calls to your parents' GP pretending to be your mother. You are described by one of your sisters as having always been a compulsive liar. That description is clearly justified, but it hardly captures the elaborate, extensive and enduring web of deceit that you spun and maintained over months and years. In September 2023, your parents' GP alerted the police. He was concerned that he had not seen them and that their appointments were repeatedly cancelled. A police officer spoke to you by phone. You gave an intricate but untruthful account that your parents were travelling. On the 15th of September 2023, officers attended at your home and arrested you on suspicion of murder. It was inevitable that they would discover the bodies of your parents and your responsibility for their deaths. What happened next is caught on their body-worn video. You admitted, in a matter-of-fact manner, that you had murdered your parents and told the officers where they could find the bodies. This again demonstrates a lack of effect on the part of McCullough's part, a straightforward description of what's going on. The impact of your offending is vividly described by Lois McCullough's brother, Richard Butcher, and by 3 of your siblings. They have each explained in clear, dignified and moving terms the terrible effect that your crimes and deception have had on them and their families. Lack of emotional empathy. Parliament has said that where the seriousness of a murder is exceptionally high, then a whole life order should be imposed. That means that the offender will spend the rest of her life in prison. Parliament has said that the murder of 2 or more persons, where each murder involves a substantial degree of premeditation or planning, is normally an offence, where the seriousness is exceptionally high, such that the starting point should be the imposition of a whole life order. I am sure that these offences involved a substantial degree of both premeditation and planning. You had considered killing your parents over a period of 3 months. In that period, you accumulated a large amount of prescription drugs. In May 2019, you bought a knife as well as implements to crush and separate tablets. You put small doses of the drugs in your parents' lunch to test their effect. You drugged your father's drink 2 days before the murders in order to use him as a guinea pig. This demonstrates the level of premeditation and planning that is involved by this individual. It also shows her callousness, and absence of emotional empathy. You had a primary plan, which was to use drugs to cause their deaths, and you had a backup plan, which was to use murder weapons if your primary plan failed. It follows that the starting point is that a whole life order should be imposed. That is subject to consideration of the aggravating and mitigating features of the case, and an overall assessment of the sentence to be imposed. Aside from the fact that there were 2 murders, which both involve substantial planning and premeditation, there are a number of aggravating features. Murders for gain. I am sure that a substantial motive for each of the murders was your intention to avoid your parents discovering that you had been stealing from them and lying to them, and to enable you to continue to take monies that were intended for them. Potential nullification of threat to control. Sense of entitlement. The murders were therefore done in the expectation that you would gain financially and as a result of your parents' deaths. They were murders done for gain. As Richard Butcher put it, you think more of money than you do of humanity. Domestic context and abuse of trust. Your economic abuse of your parents amounted to domestic abuse within the meaning of the Sentencing Council's overarching guideline. The murders took place in that context. Further, your parents were entitled to feel safe in their own beds and in their own home. They were entitled to feel safe from their daughter. Your conduct amounted to a gross violation of the trust that should exist between parents and their children, that is a significant aggravating feature. This also highlights the complete absence of emotional empathy exhibited by McCullough. Vulnerability. Your parents were not of advanced old age. They were able to take care for themselves, and they were not particularly vulnerable. But they were, to some extent, vulnerable because of their age and because of your father's ill health. As their daughter and someone who they trusted with their finances, you were in a position of trust in relation to them. You had a significant level of responsibility towards each of them, and they were each entitled to rely on you. These are each aggravating features. However, they are also linked to the domestic context, and there is a considerable degree of overlap. I take account of the overall impact of these factors in increasing the seriousness of the offences, rather than artificially compartmentalising and then adding different overlapping aggravating factors. Concealment of bodies. The fact that you concealed your parents' bodies for so long and maintained the deceit that they were both still alive is a substantial aggravating factor. It robbed them of dignity in death, and it no doubt substantially increased the distress and suffering of your siblings. Sense of entitlement, lack of accountability, absence of emotional empathy. Use of weapons. You used a hammer and then a knife to assault your mother. The fact that many murders involve the use of a weapon does not mean this is not an aggravating feature. It is. Mitigating factors. As to mitigating factors, you accuse your parents, blame shifting, of conduct which might be said to involve some emotional and other neglect when you were young. Your sisters do not support everything you say. But in any event, you were in your 30s when you killed them. Any difficulties in childhood do not begin to explain or excuse what you did. It does not amount to significant mitigation. Now, pausing there, it may well be, of course, the case that something has happened to McCullough in her childhood, which is absolutely central to why she has behaved as she does. However, what the judge is driving at is to say that in the ordinary context, you think about mitigation. For instance, you were provoked by somebody in a street fight and so you were defending yourself, or that you were currently the victim of abuse and you lashed out. That's what the judge is driving at. Clearly, those factors are absent. Mental health. I have the benefit of extensive medical evidence, including reports from experts instructed by both prosecution and defence. At the time of the offences, you had developed symptoms of personality disorder and autistic spectrum condition. You may also have had some mild depression. Since the offending, you have developed some psychosis. These factors amount to personal mitigation, and they are relevant to the impact that custody will have on you. You also have some physical difficulties, which I likewise take into account. The autistic spectrum condition may also explain the matter-of-fact way in which you admitted to the murders when you were arrested. It is suggested in one of the reports that you might have thought that you had a binary choice between living with your parents and killing them, and that this is likely to have been a consequence of autism. However, the evidence compellingly shows a financial motivation for killing your parents, rather than feelings of being trapped in the way that you describe. None of the experts suggest that your autism is responsible for your general dishonesty, or for stealing from your parents, or from reaching the position where your dishonesty was likely to be uncovered. And even if your autistic condition had a narrowing effect on the choices that you thought were available to you, you nevertheless made a free, deliberate, and conscious decision to murder your parents. None of the experts suggest that decision was motivated or caused by your autistic condition. Accordingly, the experts have identified the suggestion of some autistic condition, but it's been made very clear that that effectively is irrelevant with regard to her behaviour in terms of what she had done. In the light of my assessment of the evidence, and in particular the reason for the offending, there is no scope for a finding that your mental health substantially reduces your culpability. On the contrary, there was no impairment of your ability to understand the nature of your conduct, to form a rational judgment, and to exercise self-control. These were considered acts of aggression following months of thought and planning. Previous good character. You have no previous convictions. However, before you murdered your parents, you stole from them and committed fraud against them over a considerable period of time. Your lack of previous convictions only has limited weight in mitigation. Admissions. You initially lied to the police when they called you in September 2013. But when they arrived at the house, you made full and frank admissions. You provided PINs and passwords to enable the police to interrogate your digital devices. You did not answer questions in interview, and you did not indicate guilty pleas in the magistrate's court, but you did plead guilty when you were first arraigned. Your admissions and cooperation with the police amount to significant mitigation. Remorse. You claim to be remorseful for your offending. You admitted the offences and gave the police and the medical experts detailed accounts. You have pleaded guilty, and there are some indications from recorded calls at around the time of the offending that you felt sorrow at what you had done. I accept that there is a degree of remorse in the sense of feelings of guilt and sadness and a recognition and acceptance that what you did was very wrong. But there is also a considerable element of self-pity, and any feelings of remorse are largely overshadowed by your failure to take practical steps to demonstrate any remorse by handing yourself into the police and instead spending years covering up what you had done and spending your parents' pensions. Pausing there, I would suggest that she shows no remorse whatsoever. The fact that she planned what she did, the fact that she covered it up thereafter, the fact that she probed with the police to find out if they knew anything about her, the fact that she continued to steal, the fact that she lived with the bodies, is all demonstrative of an individual that's entirely devoid of remorse. And it's only later that she has demonstrated some form of sorrow, which to my mind is manufactured. The judge added, "You recognise and accept that you will be sentenced to imprisonment for life, and there are signs that you're making productive use of your time in custody." Well, what else is she going to do? The judge poses the question, whole life order or minimum term order? A whole life order is a sentence of last resort that is reserved for crimes of exceptional seriousness. In borderline cases, or in cases where there is any doubt, a minimum term order is likely to be the just disposal. In the present case, a whole life order is the starting point. Having regard to all the circumstances of the case, including your immediate admissions to the police and your guilty pleas when you were first arraigned, this is not one of those cases of the most exceptional seriousness where a whole life order as a sentence of last resort is required. I therefore impose a minimum term order. That means you will remain in custody for at least the minimum term. Once you have served the minimum term, it will be for the parole board to decide whether and when you should be released. If you are ever released from prison, you will be subject to a license and the potential of recall to prison for the rest of your life. If you had been convicted following a trial, I would have imposed a minimum term of 40 years. I do not give you full credit for your pleas of guilty. That is in part because it is a factor that has already been taken into account by not imposing a whole life order, and in part because you did not indicate a plea of guilty in the magistrate's court. I reduced the minimum term for the plea of guilty by 4 years to 36 years. You have spent 389 days on remand, reducing the minimum term to 34 years and 341 days. I impose a statutory surcharge in the sum of £170 or such other sum as required by law. Virginia McCullough, I sentence you to imprisonment for life. I impose a minimum term of 36 years, less the time you have spent on remand. That means you will remain in custody, at least until you have served the minimum term. After that, it will be for the parole board to decide whether you are safe to be released. If you are released, you will remain on licence and will be liable to be recalled to prison for the rest of your life. Accordingly, those are the sentencing remarks provided by the judge, which provide us with further insight into the behaviours of Virginia McCullough. Some further information that has come via newspaper reporting is also useful for understanding more about her situation. The parents were described in court as being functional rather than affectionate parents, who nevertheless did love and care for their children despite being old-fashioned in their ways and were not prone to displaying affection. They slept in separate beds. McCullough was described as a compulsive liar and socially awkward by those who knew her. She claimed to suffer from complex medical issues, including thunderclap headaches, which did not surface during her time in custody, which suggests it was a lie, and had not been employed since she was a barmaid in 2017. Lack of accountability. She resented her mother, the court heard, branding her a happiness hoover, who would smack her while bathing her as a child. Prosecutors read out an account given by McCullough to police of how she carried out the murder of her own mother. It was pretty much either do it or you're going to be arrested anyway for the murder of your father. You're going to go to prison, she had told detectives. She described, when using the hammer, "I was hitting like someone badly playing the xylophone or something," she had added. Note the comparison between attempting to beat her mother to death with a hammer to someone playing the xylophone badly. There is a complete absence of emotional empathy. There is the objectification of her mother. She, as we mentioned, sent birthday cards from Moonpig and gift vouchers as presents purporting to be from her mother. She made the calls to the GPs, maintaining the pretense that they were alive. When police officers arrested her at her home, she pointed to a concrete structure which looked like a bed. She said, "I know why you're here. My father is in there. I murdered him." When police asked where her mother was, she said she's upstairs in a double wardrobe. The mausoleum for her father was made from masonry blocks and wood panels secured together with white filler. The structure was covered with multiple blankets with pictures and paintings on top. Inside, police found at least 11 layers of plastic and other materials covering the body, which was wrapped in a sleeping bag. She'd wrapped her mother's body in plastic packing and placed it into a sleeping bag, which was stuffed into a double wardrobe. The doors were taped shut and concrete blocks were placed in front. The bodies were severely decomposed and had to be identified from dental records. McCullough expressed a concern that she had not opened the wardrobe since, so she was unsure of the state inside. Her uncle urged the judge never to release his niece. He said, "Virginia is very dangerous. She has spread many lies to discover her misdeeds. Her ability to kill her parents undermines my faith in humility. She used our hope to see Lois and John to manipulate us. I have been manipulated over the years to think my sister is alive. I couldn't comprehend what has happened and still can't. I believed I was in communication with Lois, John and Virginia before hearing the awful news. I could not sleep, and I could not understand why Virginia would do such a thing and still cannot. I can never get this time back with my sister and her husband. My biggest fear is that Virginia is dangerous, and she will now have a lot of time to plan something else." Other relatives spoke of being left devastated and bereft and being forced to endure a living nightmare for the rest of their lives. One of her siblings said Virginia's immeasurable amount of lies is sickening, and blasted her lies, laziness, and greed. In a letter to the killer, one sister expressed their profound disbelief and hate for McCullough, writing, "The evilness and vindictive nature of your actions have rocked our family to its core." Thus, what are we dealing with here in relation to McCullough? Well, let us first consider, is this an individual who, as described, is autistic and then is engaged in murderous intent as a consequence of a diminution of her emotional empathy? We can dispense with that pretty quickly. To have planned the murders, to have carried them out in the way that she did, to have covered up the deaths, to continue to have lied about them, to continue to have defrauded individuals, to continue to have stolen the money, to continue to lie to family thereafter, is a sustained period of manipulative behaviour which is not linked to a temporary reduction of emotional empathy occasioned by an external stressor. It is linked to an individual who has no emotional empathy whatsoever. Accordingly, The suggestion that there was issues with gambling that might have precipitated this behaviour can be dispensed with. Furthermore, any other unidentified external stressor can also be dispensed with in terms of suggesting that that is what has generated this murderous behaviour. You will note that there was a finding of her being on the autism scale, but very clearly the experts who had the opportunity to examine her suggested that autism was not linked to what she had done. It might, of course, have been part of the flat effect that has been demonstrated, but that might also be a cause of something else. Might it be that Virginia McCullough is a narcissist? Well, she certainly behaves with a sense of entitlement. She shows no accountability for her actions. There's an absence of emotional empathy. She is manipulative. She lacks boundary recognition. There is a degree of grandiosity in her behaviours in the sense of believing that she could get away with it. However, I do not find that she is a narcissist. The reason being is that, first of all, there's no facade, which would exclude mid-range or greater. Furthermore, that would point to her being a lesser. Yet the level of planning and premeditation that she is engaged in would not be found with a lesser narcissist. It's clear that she doesn't operate instinctively in the moment, but rather knew full well what she wanted to do, knew full well what was going on, and planned and premeditated these actions. Furthermore, and this is also a highly determinative factor, is she shows no requirement for fuel. She appears very much a loner. Remember, she didn't work, no friends are mentioned, she lived with her parents. Now, there could be some narcissists that would have such a small fuel matrix, it does happen. But after they died, if we assume, for instance, her father was the non-intimate partner primary source and her mother was a non-intimate secondary source, they, along with limited interactions with tertiary sources at stores and also with other family members, would have provided suitable fuel to sustain a narcissist. The fact that she had no intimate partner, whilst unusual in the context of a narcissist, is not something that would necessarily preclude her from being one. However, what is determinative is the fact that essentially following the death of her parents, she behaved as a recluse. She lived on her own. She didn't have much contact at all with her siblings. Indeed, it would appear that her siblings didn't want to have much to do with her because they were aware that she was a compulsive liar and that she wanted to keep them at a distance for the purpose of ensuring that her murderous behaviour was not uncovered. She has not responded with a way that shows typical instinctive responses linked to a threat to control. Instead, she's shown a glibness about the whole process. The fact that she freely admitted to the fact that she'd killed them. The fact that she pointed out that her father was through there and her mother, well, it was a little more complicated, shows a glibness and superficiality with regard to her behaviour. I don't see her as a narcissist, primarily because there was no facade which would support mid-range or greater, and therefore that would suggest that she would have to be a lesser, and a lesser simply wouldn't behave in the way that she has, showing the level of control, showing the level of planning and premeditation. Furthermore, a huge factor is it does not appear that she requires fuel. Instead, what you have is an individual that exhibits glibness, that she shows that she is a pathological liar, that she is someone who engages in deception. She's conning and has a lack of sincerity. There's no sense of guilt. There's no emotional empathy. There's no remorse. She exhibits a lack of affect. I think that the experts have attributed this to autism when in actual fact this is linked to another condition. She's callous. She's engaged in a parasitic lifestyle, living off her parents. She shows poor behavioural controls in the way that she repeatedly stole from them. She has an absence of realistic and long-term plans. It sounds that there have been existing behavioural problems, as from the evidence that has been provided by her siblings. she hasn't actually accepted responsibility for her actions because, after all, it would appear that she attempted to suggest that it was a consequence of poor treatment of her by her parents. There's no evidence that drugs or alcohol amounted to an external stressor. In fact, what we have seen is an individual that was preoccupied with looking out for her own interests, that needed stimulation through gambling, that sought to steal from others in order to fund that habit, and simply saw her parents as objects that were there to be used for the provision of money, and then that they needed to be got out of the way in order to continue to enable her to have a parasitic lifestyle. Based upon this information, I regard Virginia McCullough as a pure psychopath, an individual whose calmness at arrest, whose calmness throughout trial, is all indicative of an individual that is glib and superficial, an individual who has no emotional effect, an individual who is devoid of remorse, conscience, and guilt, an individual that has a low boredom threshold and needed to be stimulated by virtue of gambling and then the planning associated with the deaths of her parents, an individual that simply saw them as a game in the way that she objectified them and killed them, an individual that wanted to gloat, in effect, about the killing, although didn't go so far as to do so, in the testing phone calls that she made to the police. Interestingly, one of the experts that was involved at the trial suggested that she was a psychopath. It's not clear on what side the individual was reporting. I would presume it was the prosecution, but they mentioned that her behaviours were such that it supported psychopathic behaviour. A psychiatrist who examined McCullough said her callousness, lack of empathy and deceptive behaviours indicates she is a psychopath. And for the reasons that I have explained in this analysis, that is a conclusion that I agree with. Virginia McCullough is a pure psychopath. Let me know your thoughts on this matter in the comments section. I'm H.G. Tudor. Thank you for listening.